The research vessel Starlight drifted silently through Earth's upper atmosphere, its sleek form designed to avoid detection by the primitive planetary defense systems below. Inside the ship's main laboratory, Rose adjusted her supportive exoframe as she studied the readings from their atmospheric analysis. Her slender fingers, each with an extra joint compared to humans, moved gracefully across the holographic display, despite the constant tremors that plagued her body. Atmospheric composition matches our previous scans, she reported to the ship's log, her voice soft but clear. The nitrogen-oxygen mix remains stable enough for preliminary surface exploration, though our species would require supplemental hydration due to the relatively dry climate. Rose's heart fluttered with excitement. As a xenobiologist, she had dreamed of studying Earth ever since learning about the planet's incredible biodiversity. Even her genetic condition, which made her muscles weaker than others of her kind, couldn't diminish her passion for research. If anything, it had made her more determined to prove her worth to the scientific community. The first warning came without any buildup. A sudden red flash filled the laboratory, accompanied by a high-pitched alarm that made Rose's antenna twitch nervously. She turned her head toward the main corridor, her pale blue skin reflecting the emergency lights. Engine core destabilizing, the ship's computer announced in its calm voice. Critical failure imminent. All personnel proceed to emergency stations. Rose felt her stomach drop. The Starlight wasn't just any research vessel. It was specifically modified to accommodate her disability, with wider corridors and support rails that allowed her to move freely even when her exoframe needed recharging. Now those same modifications would make reaching the escape pods more challenging as the ship began to shake violently. Using the wall-mounted supports, Rose pulled herself toward the emergency station. Her legs trembled more than usual, the ship's vibrations interfering with her exoframe's stabilization system. Behind her, she heard the frightening sound of metal tearing apart. Hull breach detected in sections 7 through 9. The computer reported. Atmospheric containment failing. Time to critical failure. 3 minutes. Rose reached the escape pod section just as another violent shake threw her against the wall. She caught herself on a support rail, her breath coming in quick gasps. The other crew members had already evacuated. She could see the empty pod bays as she approached the last remaining unit. The escape pod's interior was cramped, not designed with her condition in mind. Rose pulled herself inside, trying to ignore the pain as she folded her long limbs into the confined space. Her hands shook as she activated the launch sequence, each second feeling like an eternity as the ship continued to break apart around her. Launch sequence initiated, the pod's computer announced. Warning. Trajectory calculations compromised. Emergency launch advised. Rose didn't hesitate. She pressed the emergency launch control, and the pod shot away from the dying research vessel. Through the small viewport, she watched as the Starlight broke apart in a series of silent explosions, scattering debris across Earth's upper atmosphere. The pod's descent was far from smooth. Warning lights flashed across the control panel as it entered the atmosphere at a steeper angle than intended. Rose tried to adjust the trajectory, but the controls were barely responding. The pod's heat shields glowed bright orange as they hit the thicker layers of atmosphere. Warning. Stabilization systems failing, the computer announced. Brace for impact. Rose pulled her limbs close to her body and activated her exoframe's emergency protection mode. The ground rushed up to meet her, a vast expanse of sand and rock that seemed to stretch forever. The last thing she saw before impact was a brilliant flash of sunlight reflecting off the desert floor. The crash itself was a blur of noise and pain. When the pod finally came to rest, half buried in the sand, Rose found herself hanging upside down in her harness. The emergency lights flickered weakly, and hot air rushed in through several cracks in the hull. Her exoframe was damaged, its familiar hum now replaced by an irregular whine that told her it wouldn't last much longer. As consciousness began to fade, Rose realized with growing dread that she was stranded on Earth's surface, in what appeared to be a desert, with limited supplies and a failing life support system. Her last thought before passing out was a bitter irony. She had always wanted to study Earth up close, but not quite like this. The harsh sunlight pierced through the cracked hull of the escape pod, waking Rose from her unconscious state. Her head throbbed, and the desert heat had already turned the small space into an oven. She tried to move but found herself still strapped upside down, her damaged exoframe heavy against her body. "Status report," she croaked, her throat dry. The pod's computer responded with only static, another system lost in the crash. With trembling fingers, she managed to release the harness buckle, falling awkwardly onto what used to be the pod's ceiling. Pain shot through her right arm as she landed. The desert heat was unlike anything Rose had experienced before. Her species evolved on a cooler, more humid world, and their bodies required significantly more water than humans. Already, she could feel her skin beginning to dry out, its usual pale blue color turning slightly gray around the edges. "Think," she whispered to herself. "You're a scientist. Treat this like a research problem." First, she needed to check her supplies. The emergency kit was still intact, though some items had scattered during the crash. She found 3 water containers, each designed for her species' higher water needs, but 2 had cracked during impact. The remaining container would last perhaps 2 Earth days if she was careful. Her communication device was next. The sleek silver disc was cracked but still functioning, though its range was severely limited. She activated the emergency beacon, watching with disappointment as it struggled to penetrate the atmosphere. Without the ship's relay system, the signal was too weak to reach her homeworld. The real problem was her exoframe. The crash had damaged several key components, and the desert heat was affecting its power cells. Without it, her genetic condition would make movement extremely difficult. Already she could feel her muscles weakening as the frame's support systems flickered. Save power, she decided, manually shutting down non-essential systems in the exoframe. She would need it for emergency movement only. The thought of being so helpless made her antenna droop, but she had no choice. Rose turned her attention to the pod's exit hatch. Through the small window, she could see only sand and rocks stretching to the horizon. The sun was climbing higher, and she knew she couldn't stay in the rapidly heating pod. With careful movements, she gathered the remaining water, some emergency supplies, and her communications device. Opening the hatch released a blast of hot air that made her gasp. The temperature control implants under her skin tried to adjust, but were overwhelmed by the extreme heat. She would need to find shelter soon or risk complete system failure. Using the pod's outer hull for support, Rose pulled herself out into the desert. Her legs shook with the effort, even with the exoframe's remaining power diverted to basic mobility. The sand shifted treacherously under her feet, and she nearly fell several times before reaching solid ground. Looking around, Rose felt a wave of despair. The crash had left a long trail of debris, but there was no sign of civilization in any direction. The desert landscape was alien to her in every sense. The wrong color, the wrong temperature, the wrong everything. Her research on Earth's ecosystems hadn't prepared her for the reality of being stranded in one. She needed to move. The pod's wreckage would attract attention, and her species' protocol for crash landings on primitive worlds was clear. Get away from the crash site and avoid contact with local life forms. But which direction should she go? The sun was unbearable now. Rose's thermal readings showed the air temperature rising well beyond her comfortable range. She spotted some rocky formations in the distance that might offer shade. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. Every step was a challenge. The exoframe whined in protest as she forced her legs to move through the sand. Even breathing was becoming difficult as the dry air pulled moisture from her body. She had to stop frequently to take small sips of water, knowing she needed to make it last. Just keep moving, she told herself, focusing on the rocks ahead, one step at a time. Someone will come. They have to come. But as the sun climbed higher and her strength continued to fade, Rose couldn't stop the frightening thought that kept creeping into her mind. What if no one was coming? What if she was truly alone on this harsh alien world? Jack drove his old pickup truck along the desert road, camera equipment bouncing gently in the passenger seat. After 20 years as a military medic, he had found peace in photographing the desert's quiet beauty. Today, he was heading to his favorite spot to capture the sunset. Something flashed in his peripheral vision, a glint of metal where there shouldn't be any. Jack slowed the truck, squinting through the dusty windshield. Years of medical training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something felt off about this. "Well, that's different," he muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. Through his binoculars, he could see debris scattered across the desert floor. The pieces didn't look like any aircraft he recognized, and there was no smoke or signs of a recent crash. Jack grabbed his emergency medical kit, a habit he'd never broken, and stepped out into the heat. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. He'd need to work fast if he wanted to check this out before dark. As he approached the debris field, his confusion grew. The metal fragments had an odd, almost organic shape to them, with a surface that seemed to shift color depending on how the light hit it. Some pieces were still warm to the touch, despite the cooling evening air. "This isn't one of ours," he said to himself, crouching to examine a larger piece. His fingers traced what looked like writing, but the symbols were like nothing he'd ever seen. 20 years in the service, and he'd never encountered anything quite like this. That's when he noticed the marks in the sand. Years of tracking injured soldiers through difficult terrain had taught Jack to read signs others might miss. These marks told a clear story. Something had dragged itself away from the crash site. The pattern was strange, unlike any animal tracks he knew, and there were occasional deep impressions where whatever it was had apparently stopped to rest. Jack stood up, shielding his eyes against the setting sun. The tracks led toward a cluster of rock formations about half a mile away. If someone was injured out there, they'd be looking for shade. The dropping temperature meant the rocks would offer better shelter than the open desert. He returned to his truck and drove it closer to the debris field, then gathered more supplies. Water, emergency blankets, his full medical kit. He'd learned the hard way that it was better to be over-prepared. The desert was unforgiving of mistakes. Following the tracks was easier than he expected. Whatever had made them wasn't trying to hide its trail. Jack noticed small drops of an unusual blue-tinted liquid along the path. If it was blood, it wasn't human blood. "Hello," he called out periodically as he walked. "Is anyone out here? I'm a medic. I can help." Only the desert wind answered him. The sun was sinking faster now, the long shadows from the rock formations stretching across the sand like reaching fingers. Jack clicked on his flashlight, sweeping it across the ground to keep track of the trail. The marks led him around the base of a large boulder. They were fresher here, and there were more drops of the blue liquid. Whatever had made these tracks was still bleeding, still hurting. Jack's medical training kicked into high gear. Bleeding meant there was still life, and where there was life, there was a chance to help. He rounded the boulder, flashlight beams sweeping the area, and froze. There, huddled against the rock, was a figure unlike anything he'd ever seen. Humanoid, but clearly not human. Its pale blue skin had a grayish tinge, and what looked like antennae drooped limply from its head. It wore some kind of mechanical frame that sparked occasionally, and beside it lay a cracked device that emitted a weak, pulsing light. Jack's first thought wasn't fear or surprise, but rather a professional assessment. Severe dehydration, possible heat exhaustion, injured right arm, and what appeared to be some kind of mobility issue even without the crash injuries. The medic in him took over, pushing aside all other questions. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he set down his medical kit. "Looks like you could use some help." Rose's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the gentle voice. Through her blurred vision, she saw a human figure crouching nearby. Her first instinct was to run, but her damaged exoframe and exhausted body wouldn't cooperate. All she could manage was a weak movement that sent pain shooting through her arm. Jack noticed her panic and stayed where he was, keeping his hands visible. "Easy there," he said softly, the same tone he'd used with wounded soldiers. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm a medic, a healer. You're injured and need help." Rose's translator implant was struggling to function in the heat, but she understood enough. Her species had studied Earth languages extensively. She tried to speak, but her dry throat produced only a rough sound. Her antenna twitched weakly, reflecting her distress. "Water first," Jack said, slowly reaching for his canteen. He noticed how her eyes tracked the movement, the desperate thirst evident in her expression. "Let's take care of the basics, then worry about everything else." He opened the canteen and took a small sip first, showing it was safe. Then he moved forward carefully, ready to stop if she showed any fear. Rose watched him with a mixture of caution and desperate hope. Her own water had run out hours ago, and her body was screaming for hydration. When Jack held the canteen to her lips, Rose drank eagerly. The water was warm from the desert heat, but it felt like life itself flowing into her parched body. She had to force herself to take small sips, remembering her scientific training about rapid rehydration dangers. "Slow and steady," Jack encouraged, noting her self-control despite obvious desperation. "That's good. Let's check those injuries now, okay?" Rose managed a small nod. The water had helped her translator implant stabilize, and she found she could understand him better. She watched as he opened his medical kit, noting how different it was from her people's advanced medical technology. Yet there was something reassuring about his confident movements. "My name's Jack," he said as he began examining her injured arm. "I was a military medic for 20 years. Now I just take pictures of the desert. Lucky for both of us, I still carry my medical gear out of habit." Rose tried to speak again, managing a whisper this time. "Rose," she said, using the closest Earth name to her real one. "Thank you for helping." Jack smiled, pleasantly surprised by her ability to communicate. "Nice to meet you, Rose. Your arm's not broken, but you've got a bad sprain. The bigger concern is this heat exhaustion. Your skin temperature feels way too high, even for the desert." He noticed her damaged exoframe and the way her limbs trembled. "This device, it helps you move." When Rose nodded, he examined it more closely. "Some kind of mobility assist technology. It looks damaged." "Yes," Rose whispered. "Genetic condition. Muscles weak without it. Heat, affecting power cells." Jack's face showed understanding rather than pity. "Okay, that gives us two immediate priorities. We need to cool you down and get you somewhere with stable temperature before this heat does more damage. Then we can look at helping your mobility." He pulled an emergency blanket from his kit, the metallic surface designed to reflect heat. With gentle movements, he created a makeshift shelter, blocking the worst of the desert heat. Rose felt her thermal regulation implants beginning to function better almost immediately. "Rest for a few minutes while I set up something better," Jack said, his mind already planning the next steps. "My truck's not far. We can get you to proper shelter before dark." Rose knew she should be afraid. Every protocol her people had about contact with humans warned against this exact situation. But as she watched Jack efficiently working to help her, she felt something else. Trust. There was a kindness in his actions that transcended species. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why help? Unknown being." Jack paused in his work, looking at her with serious eyes. "Because you need help. That's all I need to know. Everything else, what you are, where you're from, that's just details we can figure out later." In that moment, despite her pain and fear, Rose began to understand why her people's assumptions about humans might have been wrong. The inside of Jack's small desert cabin was a welcome change from the harsh outside environment. Rose sat on a comfortable chair, wrapped in light blankets, while Jack worked on jerry-rigging a cooling system using some old fans and wet cloths. Her thermal implants were finally starting to stabilize in the controlled environment. "It's not fancy," Jack said, adjusting the fans, "but it should help keep your temperature down. How's the arm feeling? Rose moved her injured arm carefully, testing the bandage Jack had applied. Better, she said, her voice stronger now that she was properly hydrated. Your medical skills are surprisingly advanced. Jack chuckled as he prepared a solution of water and electrolytes. 20 years of patching up soldiers in tough conditions teaches you a lot. Though I admit, this is my first time treating someone from another planet. He handed her the drink, and Rose accepted it gratefully. Her translator implant was working much better now, making communication easier. She watched as Jack pulled up a chair across from her, keeping a comfortable distance. Can you tell me more about this? He asked, gesturing to her exoframe. I might be able to help, but I need to understand how it works. Rose hesitated for a moment, then decided that trust had to go both ways. It's a medical device, she explained. I was born with a condition that affects muscle strength. The frame provides support and helps with movement. But the crash damaged it, and the heat affected its power cells. Jack leaned forward, genuinely interested. Like an external nervous system support, we have similar technology on Earth, though not as advanced. He paused, thinking. The power cells, do they run on electrical energy? Yes, Rose confirmed, but they're designed for much cooler temperatures. The desert heat caused them to malfunction. That we can work with, Jack said, standing up. He went to a cabinet and returned with some tools and what looked like a small solar power bank. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to try something. Over the next hour, Jack and Rose worked together. She explained the basic principles of her exoframe's power system, while he used his practical knowledge to create a makeshift cooling system for the power cells using computer fans and heat sinks from his spare parts collection. Your people would probably consider this primitive, Jack said as he worked. But sometimes simple solutions work best. Rose watched him with growing admiration. We're taught that humans are less developed, but you show so much creativity. You solve problems differently than we would. Necessity is a good teacher, Jack replied, making final adjustments to the cooling system. How does that feel? Rose felt the exoframe's power stabilize, its familiar hum returning to normal. She moved her legs experimentally, finding the support much improved. It's working, she said, amazed. You fixed it with such basic materials. Sometimes basic is better than fancy, Jack said with a smile. Fewer things to go wrong. He sat back down, his expression becoming more serious. Now, about your people, will they be looking for you? Rose nodded, touching her communication device. Yes, but my beacon is too weak to reach them. The crash damaged our main ship's relay system. Could we boost the signal somehow? Jack asked. I've got some radio equipment from my military days. Different technology, but maybe we could combine them. Rose felt a surge of hope. That might actually work. If we can modify the frequency range. She stopped, looking at Jack curiously. You're not afraid of helping an alien contact others of her kind? Jack shrugged. Should I be? You needed help, I helped. Simple as that. If there are more of you who need help, well, that's what I do. Rose felt her antenna quiver with emotion. You're very different from what our studies told us about humans. Maybe that's the problem with studies, Jack said gently. They don't always show the whole picture. Sometimes you have to meet someone face to face to really understand them. As the desert night fell outside, Rose realized she was experiencing something her research had never prepared her for: genuine friendship with a human. Morning light filtered through the cabin's windows as Rose examined the medical supplies in Jack's kit with fascination. Her strength had returned significantly after a night of rest in the cooler environment, and her curiosity was getting the better of her. Your medical techniques are so hands-on, she said, holding up a simple stethoscope. We rely heavily on automated systems and bioscanners. I never thought about what happens when those systems fail. Jack watched her with amusement as he made breakfast. Sometimes the old ways work best. Can't tell you how many times I've had to work without power in the field. A good medic needs to know how to handle the basics. Rose activated a small hologram from her partially repaired communication device, showing Jack images of her people's medical technology. This is what we normally use: automated surgical units, cellular regeneration chambers, neural interface diagnostics. Impressive, Jack admitted, bringing over 2 plates of food. But I notice it all depends on power and complex systems. What happens when those break down? Rose's antenna drooped slightly. That's actually a problem we've faced in disaster zones. Many of our doctors don't know how to work without the technology. She paused, considering. Like what happened to me in the desert. Jack nodded, sitting down across from her. That's why I keep training with basic tools. Technology can fail, but knowledge stays with you. He gestured to her exoframe. Though I have to admit, your tech is amazing. The way it interfaces with your nervous system, we're still working on perfecting something similar. But you found a way to fix it with simple parts, Rose pointed out. That kind of adaptability. We don't teach that enough. She took a careful bite of the breakfast Jack had prepared. Your food is interesting too. So many different textures and tastes. They spent the morning exchanging knowledge. Rose explained the principles behind her people's medical technology, while Jack shared his experiences treating injuries in difficult conditions. Each found themselves fascinated by the other's perspective. Tell me about being a medic in your military, Rose said, her antenna perking up with interest. Our healers rarely leave our medical centers. Jack's eyes grew distant with memory. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't the medical work. It was giving hope to someone who was scared and hurting, far from home. He looked at her meaningfully, kind of like finding someone lost in the desert. Rose felt a warm feeling in her chest. You've shown me that humans have so much more depth than we realized. We thought your technology level meant you were. She struggled for a polite word. Primitive, Jack suggested with a smile. Less advanced. Maybe we are in some ways. But technology isn't everything. Sometimes the most advanced solution isn't the best one. To demonstrate, he pulled out his old camera. Take this. I could use a digital camera with all the latest features. But I prefer this older model. It makes me think more about each shot. Focus on what really matters. Rose studied the camera with interest. It's like how you treated me. You didn't have advanced scanners or biomonitors. You just knew what to do by looking and listening. Experience and intuition, Jack agreed. Plus a healthy dose of paying attention to what's right in front of you, rather than what you expect to see. They were interrupted by a beeping sound from Rose's communication device. The signal booster they had rigged together was picking up something. Rose quickly checked the readings, her antenna quivering with excitement. It's working, she exclaimed. The modified signal. I think it's reaching orbit. Jack felt a mix of happiness and sadness. Your people will be able to find you now. Rose looked at him, her expression soft. When they come, they need to know about you, about how wrong we were about humans. This connection we've made, it could change everything. Sometimes the best discoveries happen by accident, Jack said quietly. Like finding an alien girl in the desert. They shared a moment of understanding, both aware that their unexpected meeting might lead to something much bigger than themselves. The desert sky lit up with a soft blue glow as the rescue ship descended. Jack and Rose stood outside the cabin, watching as the vessel's sleek form emerged through the evening clouds. After 3 days of waiting, Rose's people had finally arrived. They're trying to be discreet, Rose explained, her antenna moving in what Jack now recognized as amusement. Though I'm not sure a glowing spacecraft is very subtle. Still better than my first meeting with you, Jack replied with a smile. At least they're not crash landing. The ship settled gently on the desert floor, stirring up little dust despite its size. Its surface seemed to shift colors like oil on water, adapting to match the desert's evening tones. A door opened silently, and 3 figures emerged. Rose straightened her posture, her repaired exoframe humming smoothly. Jack had helped her prepare for this moment, but she still felt nervous. This wasn't just a rescue. It was first contact between her people and humans, and she wanted to do it right. The three aliens approached cautiously, their own exoframes marking them as medical personnel. They stopped short when they saw Jack, their antenna twitching in surprise. "It's okay," Rose called out in her native language. "He saved my life. He's a healer, like us." She switched to English. "Jack, these are my people's medical officers. They're just surprised to see you here." The lead medical officer stepped forward, looking between Rose and Jack with obvious curiosity. "You've been caring for her?" he asked in slightly accented English, their own translator working to bridge the gap. Jack nodded. Rose needed help. The rest was just details to figure out along the way. The medical team conducted a quick scan of Rose, their expressions changing from concern to amazement. One of them examined her exoframe closely, particularly the modifications Jack had made. "This cooling system," the second officer said. "It's simple but incredibly effective. And you did this with local materials." "Jack is very resourceful," Rose said proudly. "He's taught me that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Our assumptions about human capabilities were incomplete." The lead officer seemed to come to a decision. "We need to report this to the council. A human helping one of our own, adapting our technology, providing medical care." He looked at Jack with newfound respect. "This changes things. I hope it changes things for the better," Jack said simply. "Rose showed me that we have a lot to learn from each other." Rose moved closer to Jack, her antenna drooping slightly. "I have to go with them," she said softly. "But this isn't the end. My report about you, about what happened here, it's going to open new possibilities for both our peoples." Jack smiled warmly. "You've got my coordinates. Next time, try to visit without the crash landing." The medical team prepared to leave, but Rose had one more surprise. She pulled out Jack's old camera, which she had repaired using her people's technology, while maintaining its original character. "A reminder," she said, handing it to him, "that sometimes old and new can work together perfectly." The camera now had subtle improvements but kept all the features Jack loved about it. As the rescue ship prepared for departure, Rose turned to Jack one last time. "Thank you," she said, "not just for saving me, but for showing me what humanity truly is. Your compassion, your creativity, your willingness to help a stranger. These are worth more than any advanced technology. Just remember us little primitive humans when you're back up there," Jack said with a wink. "Oh, I'll do better than remember," Rose replied, her antenna curving in what Jack now knew was a smile. "I'm going to make sure our peoples meet properly this time. After all, we've got a lot to learn from each other." The ship rose silently into the darkening sky, its glow fading until it was just another light among the stars. Jack stood watching long after it disappeared, his modified camera in his hands. The desert around him felt different now, no longer just a place of solitude, but a site of new beginnings. The next morning, he found a small silver disc near his cabin. On it was a message in Rose's elegant writing. "Sometimes the best discoveries are the ones we never expected to make. See you soon, friend."